Hello, everybody. It is Saturday at 10 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. I, of course, am Chris Weave, and let me adjust my computer a little bit so the angle's a little bit better on the camera. So plan A is that Alec is going to be here tonight, and Alec said he's going to be here tonight, but Alec is not yet here. And so I think he's just running a little late or lost track of the time or something like that. I just sent him a little note saying, hey, you coming? So hopefully he'll show up very soon. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and start with Autumn. Hope everybody had a good week. Hello, Delon. Hello, Rob. Hello, Hermano. Hello, everybody who's here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about refits. And I'll tell you how this show, this particular topic came about. So I was traveling last week, as I said, and I get this message from Alec at one point. I think it was on Friday night saying, you're saying, log on to StreamYard, urgent. And it's like, oh, okay. So I didn't get it until like 2 hours after he sent it. And so I said, hey, dude, what's up? And he said, oh, we had some questions about refits and how the Navy does that and stuff like that. And I said, sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I was here with a friend of mine. But, you know, hey, we can do that as a topic on the show next week if you want to join me on the show. And he said, sure, let's do that. And so here I am by myself, but I'm sure he'll be along. But I did put together a few slides. I can start by going through those slides, and then we'll see what happens when he eventually shows up. So, in fact, you know what? Let me send him a text message in addition to the other message. Oh, here he comes. Hello, Alec. All right, so he's working on audio. So I'll keep talking while Alec is booting up, and so and getting everything together. So let's start off with the obvious. I am not speaking for my employer. Alec presumably is speaking for his employer, but I am not. That is the big difference between the two of us tonight.
Can you hear me?
Alec, are you there?
Yes. Can you hold on?
Yes, I can hear you.
You hear me now?
Oh, you were glitching a little bit, but I can hear you.
Okay, we should be good now.
Okay. All right. Good. So how have you been?
Oh my gosh. I'm good. I was just in downtown Atlanta visiting with chap I coached for when a couple years ago, so I was at a big volleyball event, and I raced back here so I could get on with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All good. Yeah, and well, I got home about 30 minutes ago. Walk the dogs, feed the dogs, clean up after the dogs. Get my laundry from the washing machine to the dryer. I mean, just like and I think we're now all the errands are set, so we should be good to go.
Okay, good. So I got back in town yesterday from a trip that was 2 weeks, where I went to Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia, Greenville, South Carolina. I got to drive through Atlanta traffic the next day on my way to Montgomery, Alabama, then Huntsville, Alabama, and then back to Dayton.
And you didn't stop by?
I was on a schedule. On a schedule.
All right. Well, you should have called me and said, I'm driving through Atlanta. I would have met you at Waffle House.
That might have worked. It was a 5-hour drive that day.
We'll do it next time.
Yeah. Well, it was a 5-hour drive that day, and I think I hit Atlanta at like 7 a.m.
Oh, geez.
Okay. Greenville to Atlanta, if I remember correctly, is about 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
So I got to do morning rush hour in Atlanta. So, which was everything I dreamed it would be. So, but I survived. So, but it was a good trip overall, and I concluded it. I concluded that with a visit to the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, where I got to see a Saturn V. So I got once
and I
before.
Think I think I mentioned to you that Huntsville is also where the full-size XRV reentry vehicle from the movie Marooned is.
Yes, you did tell me that.
So yeah.
And I noticed something that I didn't notice the last time because I went in a different entrance this time. They have an A-12 out in front of the building.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not an SR-71, an actual A-12.
Wow.
And I'm not sure that I've ever seen an A-12 before.
I haven't. Yeah, I haven't. Hold on one second. Got to deal with the dog for a second. What is going on out here?
I wonder if the dogs are speaking for their employer. Could be. Who knows? All right.
Food fight.
So let's see. Yeah.
I was going to say. Sorry, food fight. I was going to say regarding Eric's message here. It's interesting. We really need a compilation of what are the non-canon or the soft canon ships of Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
Starting with Franz Joseph, all those ships, some of which have been canonized, right?
Yeah.
Starting with them. But what else? I mean, when you think about it, all the different designs, fan designs that come out. After those Franz Joseph ones, I think the obvious ones would be the Belknap Strike Cruiser.
Yep.
And the Ascension Dreadnought. I mean, those two I see those so often. I kind of feel like those are both, part of the software.
Yeah, the Mastercom data center stuff and the Starship design stuff was just really fantastic. I still go back and reread those. So Jen's asked the question, what exactly am I wearing? What does it say?
So it keeps calm and set SCE to auxiliary.
Yes.
Is that a reference to Apollo 13?
No, it's a reference to Apollo 12.
Oh, okay. What happened in Apollo?
So on their way to the moon, during the early part of that voyage, they got hit by lightning on the ascent.
Right.
And the Capcom comes across. It's like they got blinking lights everywhere. Everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And they get the word comes up from mission control, set SCE to aux. And they all look at each other and go, what the hell is that? At which point Al Bean says, I think I know, and goes, reaches over and goes, click. and they went to the auxiliary power backup because basically they had two complete circuits there. They went to the auxiliary circuit and it fixed the problem, and they went to the moon. Do you remember what Pete Conrad said when he got to the moon? When he first set foot on the moon?
No, what did he say?
He said that may have been one small step for Neil, but it was a big step for me. Or words to that effect, because he was a little guy. He's one of my favorite astronauts. I love Pete Conrad.
Oh, and he was so well portrayed in From the Earth to the Moon.
Yeah, and that crew was fantastic. I mean, that crew was just like they were work hard, play hard, etc. I mean, you kind of got the Apollo 11 crew was professional, but you didn't really get the impression that they
had any fun.
Yeah, that's not unreasonable. I think Collins may have been the guy that Collins suggested to Neil Armstrong. He said something to the effect of, if you had any balls, what you will do is when you get out of the capsule, you'll say, what the hell is that? Scream and turn off your radio.
Very cool. By the way, talking about it, and I assume that everyone out there has seen or owns From the Earth to the Moon, the legendary HBO miniseries about the space program. If you haven't, right now, go online and get it or rent it or whatever it is. Well, if you have HBO Max, it's on HBO Max. It is absolutely fantastic. I mean, listen, for me, it's the two legendary HBO miniseries are From the Earth to the Moon and Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
Very different, of course, but From the Earth to the Moon is just spectacular.
And to the degree that it's based on anything, it's based on Andrew Chaikin's A Man on the Moon. I think that's the name of the book. And Chaikin's book is fantastic also.
I will tell you that, I think my favorite episode of that series is Spider, the one about the making of the Lem, which of course was important because I grew up on Long Island, and half the kids, in my school, their parents worked for Grumman, their fathers worked for Grumman. I mean, it just the worst thing you could do back then, the worst argument I ever got in high school, believe it or not, was when I argued that an F-15 was a better dogfighter than an F-14. And of course, all the kids' parents worked for Grumman, and they all started arguing with me. And
so for what it's worth, it's not even close.
Between an F-15 and F-14.
Yeah, it's not even close. In fact, so back in the day, when I was a professor at the Naval War College, I asked that question of my students who were pilots. I asked 15, 16, and 18 drivers, and they all said the same thing. They said, I will gladly train against any of those other two. It is not worth the fuel to train against an F-14.
Is not worth the fuel? Why?
Because they all said, I own them. It's not a good training evolution for me.
But that's really apples and oranges, though, right? I mean, an F-14 was a fleet defense fighter. That's what it was all about. I mean, and Brett, I'm sure you know better than me, but my understanding was that the F-14 and the Phoenix missile were one system, basically.
Yeah, they were. Now, Phoenix was designed to fire at bombers, and we've really got. I've never gone up and sort of track down what the intelligence community's official position on this was. But we got sort of the only people that have ever fired a Phoenix missile in anger were the Iranians firing against the Iraqis. And, for some strange reason, they didn't share the data with us. And so we've got conflicting reports where some people sort of viewed, the Phoenix missile as a death ray, and other people were like, yeah, not a big deal. The thing is, the radar on the F-14, so that plane is long out of the fleet, that the radar on that was designed in the early 1970s, and it had some vulnerabilities of early 1970s radars. And if you knew how to do it, that's one of the things that, if you know what the other guys got, and you're able to do certain things against it, you can deal with that. The phrase to look up is notching the radar. So you could notch the radar, which basically means you maneuver in such a way that you're not changing your distance to it. And as a result, it's getting no Doppler off of you. And if you do it just right, you can sort of sneak around behind it. And the first that the F-14 knows that he's about to get shot down is when you make the missile call over the radio.
Yeah, interesting.
And so, I mean, the F-14 suffered from being of the 14, 15, 16, 18 class. It suffered from the fact that it was first.
Right.
The first flight was in December of 1972. And so December 31st, if I remember correctly, or December 30th or something like that, it was just barely in 1972. I got the distinct impression that they were really wanting to be able to say they flew in 1972, and those guys weren't on vacation. But it was an issue. I mean, it was an issue. Great. It's still one of my favorite airplanes. I really loved it. It was also a hangar queen from the moment it entered the fleet. And
right.
I couldn't understand why we were getting rid of them until I saw the mission availability rates, and then I couldn't understand why we kept them around as long as we did. Because it was always a hangar queen, and it only got worse. But I stood on. Let's see, it was John C. Stennis. I was in the landing signal officer's platform of John C. Stennis watching F-14s land. And I also saw takeoffs. I've been within like 25 feet of an F-14 at full afterburner.
Wow.
Yeah, because there's a line on the deck, and it's basically like if you're on this side of the line, the airplane won't hit you when it takes off. And so you want to be on that side of the line. And so we were all lined up on the line. And I think he was on the far cat. So he was on cat. I'm trying to remember if they number right. I think they number right to left. So he would have been on cat 4. And so I was on the line for cat 3. So I was a little bit farther back from that. But I mean, he's at full afterburner, and they took off. It was cool. It was seriously cool. And then while we were watching landing operations, an F-14 came down and hit hard, and the landing strut broke. And so like I'm 400 feet away from it, 500 feet away from it, because I'm at the landing signal officer's platform, and the airplane does not start moving off like they always did. And all of a sudden there's this overwhelming smell of kerosene.
Oh,
because it had punched into a fuel tank. The strut had broken and punched into a fuel tank. And it's like, yeah, we're done with landing operations until we can clear the deck. So we said, all right, thank you very much for letting us come and hang out here.
Wow.
But so it was pretty cool. That was a fantastic job. That was just a fantastic job. I mean, I watched enough flight ops that I eventually got bored of watching flight ops on an aircraft carrier. I still can't believe I'm saying that. Somebody said something back here. Let me scroll back because somebody said something. Let's see.
And in the meantime, I want to share one of my favorite photos because you and I, while we're talking about all the different aircraft, you and I have talked many times about the F-18 versus the F-18 Super Hornet.
Yes.
And this is, and so I'm going to share this with everyone. This is literally one of my favorite photos because you're like, well, what's the difference? You know, it's just another number or whatever. No, it's not. It is an entirely different airplane.
Yeah, and the thing is, if you see them superimposed over each other, it's the first time I saw the plan view superimposed over each other, I said, we lied to Congress and got away with it.
Yeah.
But the thing about the spot on an F-15 or an F-18 Super Hornet on an EF, the distance they allocate, the area they allocate for it on the flight deck is the same as an F-14. It's a big airplane.
Really?
It's a big airplane. So,
and here's just here's another look for y'all. Yeah. I mean, just I would really like to understand why they went to those huge rectangular air intakes as opposed to the older ones.
I don't know the details of that, other than I think it's a bigger airplane and I think it had more powerful engines and needed more air as a result.
Yeah, that would not surprise me. But.
Yeah, Jens points out that F-14s land for fuel and they were packing 2 Phoenix and 4 Sparrows as their combat loadout. They could carry 6 Phoenix. They never flew in that configuration because they could not land on, at least from carriers, because they could not land on an aircraft carrier in that configuration. The outboard stations couldn't handle the stress of a carrier landing with that missile because it was a huge missile.
Interesting.
Sparrows aren't small either, for that matter.
Yeah.
Sparrows are pretty huge. There was something else I was going to say about For All Mankind, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, yeah, you were talking about Spider. I remember when they pulled back in that episode, they pulled back and you see that there are hundreds of red rubber balls on top of that building.
Yeah, I know. That's a great. And one of my favorite lines. I mean, that is such a great episode because it just shows you so much about engineering and what engineering is about, and really what an amazing job they did, and how the out of the box thinking for building that lunar module, and just the fact that they were like, we got to get rid of all this weight. Well, what do? Well, the chairs weigh this much money. Well, you can't get rid of chairs. Well, what if they were standing up? And like standing up, and it's just the thought process as they talk it out. But the thing that I've used in business, I've referenced that episode in business, and I tell the people, I say, when the boss walks in and walks into the mock-up and they're trying to convince them that they can do it with, they can change the configuration around and get rid of the chairs and use triangular windows. And he goes, guys, I just don't see it. And he walks out, and the sub boss goes, well, let's make sure he sees it. And they rebuild it, and he walks back.
Hey, Alec, if you can hear me, you've frozen.
If I ever say to my crew, I say, guys, doesn't make sense to me. I can't see that. Go back and say, all right, if you really believe in it, make sure I see it. Make sure right. It's interesting, but it's a great episode. Really, just wonderful. But that whole series, top to bottom, and is really wonderful. Oh, look at that, Rob. Well, fantastic, Rob. That is just freaking awesome. That is really freaking awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, it's a fantastic episode. I, of course, was way out of college by the time that came out, so it did not influence my career at all, because I
know
already on the path that I'm currently on.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I put together a presentation about refit stuff.
Yes.
So let me go ahead and do that.
All right, and everyone, this comes out of a quick conversation that Chris and I had last week, basically all about the USS Titan A being called a refit. So, and Chris and I think Chris and I felt similar about this, and so Chris is going to make some announcements. So go ahead. Well, because I'm going to eat the other half of my keto cupcake here.
All right. So you go ahead and do that. So basically, this is just the Chris-centric schedule of what's going on. So 11 March, I'm probably unavailable. 1 April, I probably am available. Other than that, I expect that there will be a show between now and in the beginning of April, with the exception of 11 March, because I am probably going to be at a game convention that weekend. So that's not next weekend, it's the weekend after. Still planning on doing MarCon, still trying to sort of figure out what's going on. I've been traveling for a couple of weeks. I've got a convention I got to put together myself, a wargaming conference, an online wargaming conference. So I've been kind of busy with some other things, but I'll get my act together on that real soon now. Let's see, next thing. This is the same slide you guys saw the last time. Still planning on doing a Starfleet Tactical YouTube channel, working with Stogie on that. Going to do a Facebook page, just haven't done any of that stuff yet. Okay, so this is going to go back. I don't know if you've seen the last couple of episodes when I've been doing stuff by myself, Alec, but I did one on multi-mission configurable ships, and then the last time I did one by myself, I looked at the Axanar ships and put illustrations up and sort of said, here's what I see in these designs. And so we're going to see some of those same slides again, not the Axanar specific stuff, but some of those same slides again, because as it turns out, multi-mission reconfigurable ships, I'm talking about, what they did for the movie Enterprise, et cetera. That was a ship refit. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm not going to spend as much time as I did previously, because some of these slides, this will be the third time that I've shown them.
Okay.
So a quick little intro, on Star Trek, Starfleet does some ridiculous things that don't make sense. In the real world, where Star Trek is a TV show, the producers did some ridiculous things that don't make sense for reasons of audience engagement, right? Like it was originally going to be a new starship in Star Trek, the motion picture, but then they went, it's got to be the Enterprise. Okay, but it's a different ship, but it's got to be the Enterprise. Okay, so we'll just say it was a refit. And it was a refit of the sort, the U.S. Navy has done a few of these back in the day. In fact, I think I've got an example of one of them. I didn't have as much time to track this down as I wanted to. But there was a couple of instances. In fact, actually, this isn't one of them, I don't think. They did something where they basically they called it a refit, and what they did is they kept the ship's wheel and everything else they threw away. But they called it a refit. You know, I know some people that have done this with houses, right? Because it was easier to get a permit to. They couldn't get a permit to demolish the house and build a new one. They could get a permit to do some work on the house. And so what they did is they demolished all the house except one wall. And then they built a new house attached to that wall.
Yeah, exactly.
I know a couple of people who have done that. And so that's basically what some of these Star Trek refits look like. But, you know, in the real world, some navies have done some ridiculous things, which made some sense, but they kind of look ridiculous on the surface of it. And some other things that weren't ridiculous, but they were radical. And so I've got some examples of those. So we'll start off with Star Trek and look at some Star Trek examples, and then we'll go to real world examples. And these are the caveats I put up the last time. Didn't spend a whole lot of time doing research on this. These are the things that immediately came to mind. I'm not pretending that this is a comprehensive look at all this stuff. Okay, so there we got the Titan. And they would have us believe that the ship on the right is a refit of the ship on the left. And I think they set a record for coming up with a refit that was even more extreme than what we saw between the original series and the motion picture. I mean, I don't see how you get there.
There's no way.
Yeah,
there's just no way. There's no part of except maybe the bridge module, but basically there's no part of the ship on the left that you're reusing in the ship on the right. Maybe the computer core.
Now
maybe that's how you get away with Shaw's comment about purging Riker's whatever it was, his jazz,
all of his music. Yeah. So I think that, you know, there's somebody did I want to say it was a fan design based upon the Titan where they flipped the engines up so the engines are in sort of a more traditional, you know, up above the primary hull. And that actually was a sharp looking design. And if they had done that, I could say, oh, okay, I can believe that.
I could go with that.
And to be honest, I mean, my big gripe isn't that they're claiming they did that because, okay, they're doing it because they're trying to build in some continuity. I think that's okay. My to the degree I've got a gripe, it's that I think the ship on the right is not particularly attractive. I think the ship on the left is beautiful.
Really?
Yeah. I like the Titan more. The primary hull with the way the navigational deflector is buried in there into what kind of looks like, I don't know, an eraser. Is that what that secondary hull looks like?
Yes, it does. You're right.
Or, you know, it just doesn't do anything for me. It just doesn't do anything for me. And I don't like the new style engines either. I like the older style engines a lot better as well. So,
well, I think the engines on the Titan are boring as hell. But I've never listen. I'm not a fan of the Titan. All due respect to Sean Tarango, however you pronounce his name. I've never been a fan of that design. It just doesn't do it for me. The Titan A, I think the Titan A works from certain angles.
Yeah,
and certainly its profile from above is really interesting. I'm with you. I'm not crazy about the engines, but it's anyway. Go ahead. Well, I'm going to let you proceed.
Yeah, there's a couple of comments here that I thought were pretty good. Let's see. Somebody commented Danny commented that he likes the interior. Now, there's things I really like about the interior, but the thing about the interior is try to imagine working in there, right? Try to imagine working on that bridge. It's like being in a casino, except not nearly so subtle. right? It's all bright lights shining in your face all the time. And most of those lights are unnecessary. They're just there to make it bright. And you can turn all those lights off. And like, if that were a US Navy thing, all those lights would be off and they'd just be working by the lights of the screens, and they might have some indirect lighting there, but not a whole lot. I just think there's too much stuff going on, and the same is true in the hallways. They just the design aesthetic for this group of TV show producers is to just have really bright lights shining at all the time, and I just don't understand why they do that. I just don't.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's there's all the bridges are looking similar.
Yeah,
and they tend to be very cavernous.
They're way too big.
Yeah, I agree. They're way too big.
They're way too big. I mean,
you know, and probably I certainly the Strange New Worlds Enterprise hones the closest to what we've come, but even that is just so garish. It's just the colors on that bridge are just, oh wow, they just it's way too much. And I don't expect you to go back to, you know, the Next Generation bridge, which is all, you know, beige and overlit, but everything's so freaking dark.
It's either dark or it's totally bright.
Yeah. So it's dark and with a lot of lights. Right? Yeah. A lot of practical lighting. Those they're lighting those sets with a lot of practical lighting coming off of everything. So,
so Jen's made the comment that it reminds him of the Perimeter Action Ship, going back to Mastercom Data Center,
right?
With those cutouts in the rear, and it would be interesting to see if there was what the official design, if there's an in-universe explanation for why they do stuff like that. I don't think there is. I mean, because I think they're making a TV show and they're doing what they think looks cool. And hey, that's great if that's what their design aesthetic is that's great. I'm just, it doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't do anything for me.
I'm with you.
So let's see.
I'm gonna check on the cat who's whining.
Okay.
Blue Biscuit, what's going on?
I'm scrolling through this.
Stop.
Olam said something about being migraine prone. I wouldn't want to do that, and I totally agree. I wouldn't want to have all those bright lights shining in my eyes the entire time. So, okay, let me move on to the next one. So this is a slide you've all seen. This is what the old Constitution class looked like. This is from the stuff on the left is from the making of Star Trek, and the stuff on the right is a comparison of some of those things. So that's what the one iteration of what the old Constitution looked like from the original series. Here's a more modern rendition of that I looked at in some detail. And so if you go back to the episode where I looked at it, I talk a lot about what I like about this one in particular. And then we get to what the refit looks like. And the refit it shares a lot of things, but the primary hull is bigger. The engines are different. The secondary hull is bigger. I'll note that the shape of the secondary hull in the Franz Joseph stuff and in the book, The Making of Star Trek, is not the shape of the secondary hull in the model.
Oh, really?
No, yeah, take a look at that model. That model is basically an off-center cone for the secondary hull, because that was a lot easier to fabricate than this thing with the graceful curves. I like the thing with the graceful curves better, but that is not what the shooting model looked like at all. I only discovered that when somebody pointed it out to me like 2 years ago. But, you look at this and you go, yeah, those are, it's clear it's the same design language, right? You'd sort of look at it and go, the people who made the ship on the top clearly made the ship below it, but it doesn't look like it's a refit at all. And when you take a look at that secondary hull, take a look at that secondary hull, take a look at that secondary hull, that does not look like that. It does not look like that. It does not look like that or that, right? And so, but that was part of the refit. That's something that's very interesting about that refit is this is the part where I go, oh yeah, that part makes sense to me because that is them saying, we're going to totally reimagine what that secondary hull is for. You've probably got up above on top over all that stuff. You've got the engineering plant. You've got the horizontal warp shaft. You've got all that other stuff above this. But they decided that that secondary hull, rather than being sort of, hard walls, dedicated space that's pre-configured, they were going to turn it into something that was a lot more open and modular and reconfigurable and flexible. And so that I liked. I'm not sure you need that little garden, but hey, whatever. If that makes you feel better, go ahead and have a little garden there. But that as a refit, I think that is a refit that kind of works. I kind of like that refit.
And
I think the rest of it doesn't make sense, but I like this part. And it says USS Exeter because that's the name of the model the guy did. He called it the Exeter.
Gotcha. I'm going to share real quick a screenshot just to prove the point you just made.
Okay. Donnie Pearson points out that the version from the Cage is a little bit different too.
Yeah,
it's got like the taller bridge, etc. Yeah, so look at that secondary hull. That is not that nice curving sweep underneath. It's just a cone.
It's a cone. You're right. Exactly. That's exactly right. That is a pretty straight line.
Yep.
There. So there you go. All right. Let me remove that. Go back to yours.
So let's take a look at some real world ships. This is an interesting example. This is the USS Chicago that it was commissioned in like 1888, if I remember correctly. It was later given the hull number CA-14, but it was refit from 1895 to 1895 to 1899. And they took away the sails. Now, they did a bunch of other stuff. They gave it new engines, and they did this, and they did that, and the other thing. But before that, it had sails for strategic mobility because sails don't burn coal. And those early steam engines, later on, as ships get bigger, and volume goes up by basically a factor of 8 to the other dimensions, right? Double the length, double the width, double the depth. That's a 2 by 2 by 2. It's a factor of 8. So you can carry a lot more coal as the ship gets bigger. But the steam engines were really inefficient. And the idea was you'd use steam when you were maneuvering in battle, but if you're crossing the ocean, you use sails. Well, so they built it that way, but about 7 years later, they started the process of removing the sails, and the masts that you see on the right-hand side are really about signal flags. They're not even about radios at this point. Later on, they turn out to be about radios and radars and stuff, but that's about signal flags and maybe some lights up there too. You can see that the funnels also got a lot taller. And that's interesting because the taller the funnel, the more efficient it is at the updraft. That makes your boiler more efficient to have a taller funnel. That's why some plants have these super tall smokestacks, right? So why do you have a smokestack that's any taller than you need it to be? Well, the answer is you want it to be as tall as possible because it forces the updraft and it pulls air through the system more efficiently. So one of the ways that you would slow down a ship in this time period is you perforate the funnels. The ship gets slower if you perforate the funnels because the boilers get less efficient. It's also useful if you can like drop a shell in the boiler and blow the boiler up. But if you can't do that, you can perforate the funnels. And so that was a pretty massive refit that took place over time. So the next ship is the Eagle, so I couldn't find a picture of the Eagle before it was converted, but aircraft carriers are a big deal, right? The aircraft carriers all started off as cruisers or something, or colliers or something else. The early aircraft carriers started as something else and were converted. So the Eagle started as a battleship that Great Britain was building for somebody else. I can't remember who, there was a three-way arms race taking place in Latin America. ABC, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile were having this big arms race back in the day. And they were buying all their stuff they didn't have the wherewithal to actually build it locally, so they were buying most of it from the Brits. And this was going to go to one of them, and the Brits ended up taking it up and converting it into a small aircraft carrier. This, incidentally, is the reason why the flight deck of the aircraft carrier is the 04 level, when the weather deck of like a battleship is the 01 level. So why is it the 04 level on an aircraft carrier? And that's because the aircraft carrier flight deck started as platforms that were built up above it. And they built it up high enough that when you did all the numbering, it became the 04 level. So there's an entirely separate numbering scheme for aircraft carriers. So this is a fascinating ship because it got built as this weird torpedo boat carrier, the Lifudra. And so that the illustration down below is kind of hard to see, but if you sort of look, you can see that there's two sections where there are torpedo boats. There's three abreast, I think, if I remember correctly. And then there's the superstructure sort of in between. And if you look at the top, you can see there's funnels in the middle, right beneath the name Lifudra. And then in front of it, there's this crane that picks up the boat and sort of slides out on rails and lets it down. I previously included a photo of this, and I've talked about this ship before. And so that I should have included that one as well. It shows them putting a torpedo boat into the water. So they built this thing in the 1890s as a torpedo boat carrier, and then they rebuilt it for World War I as a seaplane carrier. And it was basically a cruiser hull that started off as this really weird thing, and then they turned it into something else that was really weird. I don't think they changed the guts of it at all, though, in the process of doing that. Okay, so I once saw the pictures of this ship with the caption, "What do these three ships have in common?" And the answer is they're all the same ship. Started off with these lattice masts, these cage masts. They then went to the tripod masts, which are sort of British influenced in their design. And then they eventually they sort of got rid of a lot of that stuff. And they also in the process got rid of, I believe this is one of the ships where they got rid of the armored conning tower. Because the conning tower was inside the superstructure. You'd have the bridge with windows and stuff, and you could go and look out. But then there was an area inside that you could retreat into that was actually quite cramped. If you've seen them on the Iowa class or one of the other battleships that you can go and take a look at, it's really kind of quite cramped. But the idea was that they were armored against 16-inch shells, so they've got they're like this thick, the armor. The problem is, in effect, what you're doing is you're saying we're going to put the people inside the bell, and then so that when it gets hit by the sledgehammer, they should be okay, right? No, you're not going to be okay. And they eventually concluded that if the conning tower took a hit, that it would probably kill everybody in the conning tower just from it ringing like a bell. It would still kill everybody. And so for those older ships, and the other thing is the conning towers were massive armored structures that were relatively high in the air. It's a lot of weight. It's screwing up your balance. So for the older ships, when they did the refit, they removed the conning tower. And the Royal Navy eventually stopped building ships with conning towers, like armored conning towers, because they came to the conclusion, and we kind of did too, eventually, that you'd rather have the shell pass through you'd still have some armor. You'd have what they call splinter protection, right? So it's going to deal with shrapnel. It's not going to deal with a direct hit from like a 15-inch or 16-inch shell. You'd rather have that shell go all the way through. It's going to kill whoever's in its way, but everybody else should be okay.
But it's not going to detonate.
It's not going to detonate, and as a result, you're not going to lose everybody. You're going to lose some people. Whereas if it hit an armored conning tower and detonated, it's going to ring it like a bell and it's going to kill everybody.
Well, and that's what happened. And I forget which battle it was. One of the early Pacific battles the U.S. participated in against the Japanese, and we basically had a lot of destroyers. And the Japanese were shooting their AP shells at our destroyers, and they'd go in one side and out the other, killing anyone in the way, but they wouldn't detonate. And the destroyers kept on going. This is hard enough to hit a destroyer if you're shooting with a cruiser or battleship as it is.
Yeah, and so it's just, so there's a YouTube channel called Battleship New Jersey where Ryan Szymanski, who's the curator of the Battleship New Jersey, he's done a bunch of videos about the battleship and other things. And he did one asking the question of what would have happened if we had gone ahead and built the Montanas? What modifications do you think that they would have made before they entered service? And one of the ones he said is that he thinks they probably would have gotten rid of the armored conning tower, that they wouldn't have built it with an armored conning tower. And that one of the things that when they would refit ships and take out armored conning towers, that meant that you could use that weight for guns. And they also had a tendency to move guns to centerline guns, centerline like 5-inch guns, so that it would increase your anti-aircraft capability. And because they were in the centerline, they could swing both ways. And as a result, you could put heavier guns for less mass. And that's always a good thing. But this gives you an indication of exactly how radical these things can be. Now, they didn't change the guns on these at all. They improved the fire control so the guns could hit harder. But we made a decision early on to go with 16-inch guns. We thought they were the best option. And so we were pretty standardized on 16-inch guns from like the 1920s on. And so all of our stuff was 16-inch. Now, that does not mean they all fired the same shell, because it was several marks of the 16-inch gun. Like the one on the Iowa class was the 16-inch 50, which was the Mark 7. I think the one on the class before that was like the Mark 3 or something like that. And they actually fired different shells, but it did mean that they were approximately the same, and you had the same sort of handling technology, et cetera, et cetera. And they also shot the 16-inch 50 could shoot a little bit further, but it meant that you had a lot of firepower and you could sort of standardize on that. You weren't having to deal with the fact that some of your ships dramatically outrange some of your others. Let's see. So yeah, Jens points out increase the caliber, which means the barrel got longer in this case. Caliber in handguns and caliber in naval artillery is really kind of two different measures. Caliber in handguns is diameter. When you see 16-inch 50s, it's 50 calibers, so it's 50 times the diameter of the shell. Texas Beast points out that the battleship Texas is undergoing major repairs in Galveston. Not sure if that will characterize this as a refit, though. It's interesting because, that ship had a refit to put on torpedo blisters at one point to increase its torpedo protection. And I was seeing something about during the refit that they're having to take the blisters off because the blisters are largely corroded, but they have to take them off to get to the actual hull that's underneath. And then they're going to have to format new blisters if they're going to put them on top again. But I think they're basically cutting that stuff away and sending it off to the scrapyard and reforming it.
Wow.
I think.
Damn.
Now, that's not armored. That's not armor. So that's just basically thick sheet steel of some sort. I don't know how thick, but it's not the armored part. I haven't been following that super, super closely. I've never seen that ship. Somebody else, I think Jen said something about seeing the Alabama, which is in Mobile Bay. I'm hoping to get the opportunity to see it because I'm going to have to go back down to Montgomery Air Force Base. Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery in a few months. And I'm hoping that I will have a day free in which I can do the 2-hour and 35-minute drive from where I will be to the battleship and then drive back. I did, when I was in Norfolk on this last trip, I did get a chance to go aboard the Wisconsin with a British colleague. And so I got to tell him all sorts of fun facts about the Royal Navy.
And here is, let me just, since we're talking about it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There you go. As you can see, whoop.
You may recall that there was a science fiction novel back, and I think there was actually a trilogy back in the 1980s called The Eyes of Texas. And it was about Texas. I think it involved Texas seceding from the U.S., or at least it involved Texas trying to start a war with the Soviet Union using a nuclear upgrade to the battleship Texas that included particle beams and all sorts of other fun things.
Yes.
It was a fun, albeit highly improbable novel.
Right, exactly.
Let's see. Somebody said something about getting a chance to go see the New Jersey. Yeah, the New Jersey, I've done that tour too. Haven't been on the Iowa, haven't been on the Missouri, although I've seen the Missouri I've been on a ship that went by the Missouri. I stood on a ship next to 2 Japanese officers as we sailed by the Missouri one time. That was interesting. Somebody said my audio got muddled right when I explained the plot. Yeah, the plot of the Eyes of Texas was that they were basically ambushing the Russians. The Russians were sort of browbeating the U.S. into surrendering to the Russians. This is back during the Cold War, and so some billionaire took it upon himself to secretly refit the USS Texas with a nuclear reactor and particle beams and stuff like that to go fight the Russians. And so it was a fun novel, but highly improbable. Okay, let's see. Next slide is, so this is words talking about the Iowa class. So the Iowa class got refit multiple times. And indeed, all the battleships got refit multiple times. I mean, people talk about how the Prince of Wales and Repulse, hadn't been upgraded. Well, that wasn't true. They were due for another refit, but they'd been updated. Like they'd had like 5 refits since they had gone in the water, since they had been launched. We refit stuff all the time. Everybody refits stuff all the time. That's just sort of standard. Every now and then you go in and you add more of this and you subtract stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So the Iowa class underwent a couple of different refits because they kept bringing it back, right? It was around for Korea, so it got refit several times during the war. They probably did a refit for Korea. I'm almost positive they did a refit for Vietnam, and then they came back in the 1980s. And so this is really about comparing the 1940s version to the 1980s version. So I think they kept some of the 5-inch guns as active guns, but they got rid of others of them. I think they got rid of probably all the smaller guns, although they might have kept a few just for surface defense, shooting against small boats, but they probably got rid of all of them. They got rid of all the float plane stuff. Then they added a bunch of stuff. So they added a helicopter deck on the back, and I'm sure that they added some other stuff to support the helicopter. I mean, I know that they added like control tower functions so that they could control the helicopter. They added Tomahawk armored box launchers to fire nuclear well, I don't know if they were nuclear. Presumably they had some of those. Sea-launched cruise missiles. It was certainly a nuclear-capable system, and they treat it like it's nuclear. And they're like, if you go aboard the Wisconsin, there is a guard station for the Marines to stand, for a Marine guard to be near the armored box launchers at all times. I don't know if they ever actually put nuclear weapons on or not. They added the Harpoon anti-ship missile system. They added close-in weapon system. They added the Slick 32 electronic warfare system to spoof missiles and stuff. And they added a combat engagement center to control all that stuff. And they did that by taking the Admiral's at-sea cabin and they turned it into CEC and added the controls for all that stuff. And then they went into officers' country and they sort of tore out a bunch of bulkheads and rebuilt it to recreate a cabin for the Admiral. And so the Admiral still had a cabin. He just didn't have one that he could walk right out onto the deck of the ship from his cabin. And then they also added modern comms and radars and stuff like that to make it work. So that was a pretty extensive refit. They had to find places to put all this stuff. The Tomahawk armored box launchers, they had to basically design. The battleships were the only ships that had those armored box launchers, and so they had to design those to put them on.
Wow.
Jens points out that they even had wild jump jet ramps for a radical refit of the Iowas. Yeah, in fact, if I remember correctly, the model that had that was ended up in the state capital of Iowa, and there was a couple of different versions of that, but they'd have these. The idea was that they were going to fly Harriers off of it. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. One of which is aviation gas or even kerosene is seriously dangerous. And so the thing about aircraft carriers is you want to keep them away from all that stuff, right? World War II aircraft carriers wanted to stay away from the gun line. And so presumably if the reason why you would have a battleship is it's got really thick armor and it can go up and slug it out with things, right? It's not in danger. Well, you had a bunch of aviation fuel, now it's in danger. They also were talking about doing things like removing the rear turret. Okay, that's great, except the rear turret is really, really heavy. A couple of 100 tons, maybe, something like that. The ship is designed to have that turret in place. It's designed to be stable with that turret in place. I'm told that the spine of the ship, the keel of the ship, is actually, when the turrets aren't in place, is concave. You put the turrets in place and it forces everything down so that it's straight.
Jeez.
And so you don't just take, all this weight. I wish I'd looked up how much the turrets weigh. It's probably even more than that. It's probably 1,000 tons actually. You don't just take all that stuff off and say, we'll just put some other stuff there. Like they were talking about putting surface to air missiles, like vertical cells there and something. Okay. So in the end, we didn't do all that stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. Battleships are cool. Battleship refits are cool. Dirigibles are cool. They're all cool. Don't make any sense, right? I'd love to write a novel about battleships, especially nuclear-powered battleships. I figured out how to make them nuclear-powered. But as a defense analyst, I would never actually suggest doing it in the real world. So Jen said that the Washington retrofitted a proto-CIC. Yeah. If you go back and you read, there was a book by a guy named Ivan Musicant about the battleship Washington. And I can't remember the name of it. But it's a fantastic book. And it talks about how they basically came up with a CIC-like thing. Admiral Lee had them cut a hole in the armored conning tower so they could have a radar. I think it was in the conning tower. It might have been splinter protection. So they could have put up a plexiglass screen so the radar operator could do the reverse writing and he could just turn around and take a look at it. I haven't read. He was on board Washington for a good chunk of the war. I have not read the biography of Willis Lee called Battleship Admiral. He was fantastic. He's the guy that was in command during the Battle of Washington versus Hiroshima versus South Dakota. And he was the guy in the United States Navy for battleship gunnery. I mean, everybody agreed he's the guy. And he also had a reputation for he understood radar better than his radar operators did. And he was an Olympic gold medalist. He was a marksman. And at one point, I think it was Veracruz, there was a sharpshooter that was shooting at the American troops. And his idea was that he would go out and sit on a chair and just count on the fact that when the sharpshooter popped up to shoot him, that he could get a shot off faster.
Oh, wow.
He did it, and he did.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, he was fantastic. He really was. And he died of a heart attack before the war was over. He died a couple of months before the end of the war. So, let's see. Yep, Jen says he fired back with a 1903 Springfield. So I need to go back and read that book. I also at one point when I was in graduate school, somebody who had been one of the gunnery guys aboard the Washington came and gave a talk, and somewhere, hopefully in my papers, I have his notes. And this guy said that the gun boss on Washington threw out the book and said, I don't care what doctrine says, this is what we're going to do. And what they did, they got a little lucky. They certainly got a little lucky, but they hit on their first salvo in that battle. And the guy who was doing the lecture said when they got back to Pearl Harbor, they spent the next 3 weeks doing intensive briefings for every other battleship in the force. And they basically, everybody adopted this way of doing it. So it was fantastic. Okay. That's interesting. When you look at that picture in PowerPoint, that gray square isn't there. Oh, that's an older version of it. Okay, hold on a second. For some reason, I think that's the wrong slide. Let me see if I can find it real quick and put up. Yeah, you know what? You know what? Okay, I forgot to hide this one. There we go. Okay, let's talk a little bit about submarines. Submarines are fascinating because a lot of them have had extensive refits, which is really impressive because you really can't add anything to the hull. Surface ships, you add an extra 100 tons, it's just a little bit lower in the water. Submarines, add an extra 100 tons and it's not coming back up in some cases. So first of all, we got the U.S. Ohio class where we switched a bunch of them from being ballistic missile submarines to cruise missile submarines. And that involved taking a bunch of stuff out and putting new stuff in. And they also were reconfigured to carry seals. And so some of the stuff that was used, some of the compartments that had equipment for firing ballistic missiles got emptied out. And instead they put in a gym, because the thing about SEALs is that they exercise 8 hours a day. And if they can't do that underway, they very quickly lose their edge. And so that was one of the things that they did with that. With the U.S. Los Angeles class submarines, and I don't talk about that here, I forgot to include it, but when we went from the Flight 1 to the Flight 2 Los Angeles classes, we added tubes for Tomahawk in the forward ballast tank. And so that we added these missile tubes. And we didn't go back and refit any of the old submarines, but one of the reasons why we were able to do it is that we actually had some excess, we had some reserve capacity on that. So we were able to do that. We could have gone back and refit those other ones if we had wanted to, but we didn't do that. The Russian Bore class, which is an SSBN, those are built out of pieces of never finished and also subs that have been scrapped, subs that have been decommissioned, and they've cut them apart and used parts of them, some of the engines, some of the other stuff, to build new submarines. And it's really, really fascinating. And if you go and you read Covert Shores and some other sources, they talk about that. There's been various U.S. spy submarines where in some cases, while it was still in the ways, in some cases afterwards, we cut them apart and put in a new big section in the middle. In fact, that's also the way we did the first ballistic missile submarines. We took a skipjack class submarine before it got commissioned, and we didn't physically cut it apart because we hadn't put the pieces together, but we put a missile compartment in. So the first U.S. ballistic missile submarines were basically attack submarines that had missile compartments put in. And this last one is a new submarine. It's a Swedish A-26. And the reason why it's broken up that way is that you can order it in several different configurations. So you can order it with the sail section and the nose and the stern, and it's a short-range submarine. Add another section, and it becomes a medium-range submarine. Add another section, and it becomes a long-range submarine. And the Swedes are known for periodically taking their submarines in and cutting the hull apart and replacing entire sections of the hull. And it basically comes out as a new boat with new capabilities. They do that stuff all the time because the Swedes are very clever. They get a lot of bang for their buck. So think about how much easier it is to do stuff like that when your ships look like Star Trek ships, especially the older Star Trek ships. Once you start blending all that stuff in together, it gets a little bit hard. But, the idea of, I want a different primary hull, I'll just replace the primary hull. I want different engines, I'll just replace the engines. Or even, I've got a bunch of parts, so let me rearrange them in another way, and I'll get a Miranda class instead of a Constitution class. So Starfleet ships are really designed to be modular, which means refits are a lot easier. It's also worth pointing out that one of the ways that you refit an aircraft carrier is you fly the old airplanes off and you fly new airplanes on. So you don't really upgrade battleship guns much, but you can upgrade the offensive weapon of an aircraft carrier just by flying it off and flying a new one on. So one last thing I should point out, in the interwar period, so all the battleships that were designed for World War I had guns that could fire farther than their fire control would let them hit. As fire control got better, they realized that they could take advantage of the ballistic capabilities of the guns if only they could elevate them further. And so all the major powers went through a phase where they modified their turrets so they could elevate the guns farther so they could shoot farther. And that was based upon the fact that their fire control got better, so they could hit at range, and it was worth making those changes. So same gun, but it no longer had the artificial constraint that kept it from elevating all the way. So let's see. That's I think that's all I've got for tonight. Yep, that's it.
All right. So let's talk Titan. So the issues with and what we're dealing with is really, in the script, Riker says that the Titan's a refit. And because he says that, the team there, led by Terry Metalis, felt the need to justify that comment. That, oh, yeah. But here, there's two problems I see with that. One, it's visually, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, It's not a refit. It's a totally different ship. There's nothing for them to refit. It's, maybe they kept the computer core. That's not a refit. That's your salvaging the old pit. The second thing is, it is the Titan at the end of the registry number, there's an A. Now, when the Enterprise was refit in the motion picture, it kept the same registry number because it was the same ship. It was just refit. Okay?
Yeah, we only see the A when it's a new ship.
It's a brand new ship. It's an A. So you can't say the Titan's a refit because you've already established that the A is the next ship in the line. It's not a refit. If it was a refit, it would have kept this old registry number of Riker's type.
Yeah.
So those are my two major issues with calling it a refit.
I totally and completely agree. I mean, for better or for worse, these are not the sort of things that the current crowd that are making the decisions about the current crop of Star Trek shows are that consider to be points worth including, right? It's not a big deal for them. That this is not part of their decision calculus on what to do. Now, in defense of them,
and it's surprising to me it's surprising to me because you have a bunch of Star Trek people working. I mean, and this is the problem it was a script problem. Riker said it in the script, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure the people that could have pointed this out didn't have access to the script. If it's Doug Drexler and the Okudas, well, they're said, hey, we need these panels, and they go and make those panels. They're not saying, here's a copy of the script, read it and tell us what you think.
I will point out that we know from Discovery that the writer's room, or supposedly we've been told that the writer's room for the conclusion of season 2, the big one where the Enterprise apparently has 400 fighters on board, that it was pointed out that that's not how Starfleet works. The writer's room said, no, that's wrong. And the response they got was, Star Wars has fighters, Star Wars is cool. So
yeah.
When push comes to shove, it's their TV show. If they want to do that, that's just fine.
Yeah.
And it's not totally inconsistent with what we've seen in the movies. Like I said at the beginning, they should have just called it a different ship other than the Enterprise, or they should have just said, we decommissioned the old Enterprise. Here's the new Enterprise. Instead, or, the old Enterprise is now a museum ship. There was a whole bunch of ways that they could have done it. But, when it comes to the movies in particular, but sometimes with the TV show, there are times where it's like there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it, and you can count on them to pick the worst one.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. We've seen that a couple of different times where it's like, like for instance, I would have been a lot happier with the JJ movies if they didn't try to claim that it was somehow a similar continuity, right? If you would have just said, hey, we're going to reboot, live with it, I would have said, oh, okay, I can live with that. I don't see the reason for it, but the entire idea that Spock's part of it, and then with the silliness of, Spock himself helped save Earth using time travel about 4 different times, but Vulcan's expendable. So it suffered from story problems too. But when push comes to shove, I'll have the standard caveat that I always have, which is nobody should not like something that they previously like because of something I say. My goal is not to make anybody not like anything. My goal is to sort of sit back and go, as a defense analyst who spent a lot of time, this is my hobby, is taking all the things that I know about, that I do in my day job and applying it to science fiction. Here's what I see as a professional looking at it. Right. And, sometimes I'm speaking as a professional, sometimes I'm speaking as a fan, and, lots of different sources, which Star Trek, I always start with, when somebody says Star Trek is X, it's like, which Star Trek? Because there's right. Star Trek.
Well, and listen, I think the challenges that I have, and with the new Picard, I think we've kind of hit him. I mean, I'm not happy with the bridge is just a major source of pain for me. This whole refit thing is, another one. But it doesn't, the challenge that you face is, I'm not throwing Picard under the bus. I didn't throw the first 2 seasons under the bus. I thought they were uneven. You and I have talked about the challenges in the first 2 seasons. Those challenges may exist in this season. We'll have to wait and see. Last night I went and listened to Doomcock's live stream, and which I haven't done in years. And because he's been very, very, very negative about Kurtzman, and there's a lot of negativity there about Kurtzman and Kathy Kennedy, and who's running Star Trek, who's running Star Wars. And I don't, I'm not. That's not the way I am. I will make criticisms about specific things that I don't like. And if there are things I don't like about Picard season 3, I'm really not going to blame Kurtzman for it, because he doesn't have a lot of. Terry Matalas is the showrunner. Kurtzman doesn't have a lot to do really with this. So just like on Strange New Worlds, that's. Hey, listen, when Pike was introduced in season 2 of Discovery, and everyone's like, yeah, that's the guy we want to see. Hey, Kurtzman's the guy that greenlit Strange New Worlds, said, look, Star Trek fans love this guy. They want to get back to traditional Star Trek storytelling. Let's give it to them. And they did, and it was brilliant. So
and I watched all of the first season, I think, except the last episode, if I remember correctly.
Oh my God, that's the best one.
Yeah. I think I couldn't get through all of them. I just didn't have the time.
Oh,
and the Space Whales one, I always call it the Space Whales, despite the fact they never call it that one. But the one I'm talking about, right? That episode was just brilliant. I mean, I just really liked it. I mean, that episode spoke to me in the same way that Field of Dreams speaks to me. And so, it was entertaining. It didn't convince me that I wanted to shell out the money to do it, especially since I don't have a whole lot of time to just sit and watch stuff. And I need to make time to sit and watch stuff, because I've told people who watch the show that I'm going to watch stuff and comment on it. Like, for instance, Babylon 5. At some point I'll start doing Battlestar Galactica again, and I still want to do Andromeda and a few other things. So I need to be better about watching stuff. But Discovery, I had kind of come to the conclusion that, if I was watching it because it was Star Trek, then it wasn't worth my time. But it was okay science fiction, right? I was happy with watching it. And then I got to the end of the first season, or second season. The second season, I will admit, it broke me. It broke me.
Yeah.
That last episode, I just sort of went, you know what? I felt like the people who made the decisions on what that episode was going to look like did not show me any respect as a viewer.
Yeah. Listen, Discovery is a mess. It is a mess. And
the entire idea, he's going to stand behind the blast door, because it's called a blast door. It's magic. And he can stand behind the blast door and watch the photon torpedo that's 10 feet away from him blow off the front third of the primary hull. But he's okay because he's standing behind something called a blast door.
Well, and that's, listen, and that's when you have non-Star Trek people writing stuff, right?
Well, I actually think that's worse than that, right? It's not just non-Star Trek people. It doesn't make, translate it into everyday terms, right? It's like saying, I'm going to stand behind a blast door and the bomb is going to collapse the rest of the building, but because I'm behind a blast door, I'm okay. It's not how that works.
Yeah.
And then the other scene that really got me there was, at one point, they take a shot, it blows a hole in the ceiling, and these doors snap shut over the hole, because you just have extra doors on the outer hull of your ship, just ready to snap shut.
Oh, and don't get me started on the turbo lift.
Oh yeah, the turbo lift, and like that hull was entirely, yeah. So, but up until that point, I was pressing the I believe button. I was pressing the I'm enjoying this button, right? I wasn't real happy with Section 31 deciding that they were going to do a Terminator crossover. But hey, I really like actually AI rampant type of stories. It didn't feel like Star Trek, but I wasn't thinking of it as Star Trek at that point.
Well, and that's it. I think Discovery is good science fiction, but not good Star Trek.
Yeah, and I always feel nobody should let me be the gatekeeper for their Star Trek.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. You
Yeah.
decide what you like, and listen. And if you hate all Kurtzman Trek like Doomcock did, and the people that watch it, God bless you. That's your choice.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you what to like. And by the way, I will say, I've given Doomcock a little shit in the past. His live stream was really good. It was not what I expected. Despite the rampant hatred of all things Kurtzman, it was really, he sings a lot, and it was kind of funny and interesting, and he has a good rapport with his audience, and so I was pleasantly surprised by what I saw. But getting back to Kurt, here's my take: if why you can't throw Kurtzman under the bus, and I've defended Kurtzman before, and my take is this: so we have 5 shows. We best have 5 shows from Kurtzman: Discovery, Lower Decks, Prodigy, Picard, Strange New Worlds. Now, Strange New Worlds is an absolute win. It is one of the best Star Trek shows. I would put it, right up there with TOS and Deep Space Nine. It's in the top 3. Lower Decks is brilliant.
Yeah.
Prodigy, I'm going to watch Prodigy because I watched Sean Ferrick's Trek Culture review of it, and it looks way more interesting than I thought it was. I don't think it really is a kid's show. That's what I'm being told. So I'm going to give it the chance because there's so much, Trek canon universe building there that I want to see it.
Some of the best kids shows are shows that are accessible to kids. That doesn't mean they're just about kids. Like, have you ever watched Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future?
Oh, no, but I know all about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a kid's show.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's really not. It was Michael Straczynski. It's not a kid's show.
Right. Yeah. So Strange New Worlds win, Lower Decks win, Prodigy win. All right. So 3 of the 5 shows are a win. So he's basically 3, and then Picard, I would argue, is a draw. I'm not going to say it's a win. We'll see how season 3 goes. The first 2 seasons were very uneven. There was stuff I loved. There's stuff I hated. But say it's a draw. And then Discovery is a clear loss because Discovery is the worst Star Trek series ever. It really is. And I would say the majority of Star Trek fans would agree with me. I could be wrong, but I think that they would. So, all right. So basically, Kurtzman's 3-1-1. That's a freaking awesome record.
Yeah.
And in Hollywood, that's an amazing record.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay. You think of all the freaking losers in Hollywood that get to keep on making shows, and you're just like, how did you get to you're below the Mendoza line and you're still making shows on, so I just think that Kurtzman is, gets a bad rap. I really do. I think the argument is that he's 3-1-1.
Yeah. And, if he's able to get Star Trek made, and he's able to hold an audience, then he clearly knows what he's doing. Now, does that mean he holds me?
Doesn't have to.
Not necessarily, but he doesn't have to, right?
Yeah, and you don't have to agree with me that he's 3-1-1. You may hate all of the Star Trek stuff, but I think most people feel the way I do, that Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks are absolutely home runs.
Yeah,
and Prodigy is a good show. It's hard to argue that Prodigy is not a good show. You don't need to be in the demographic. So that being said, and here's the other thing that needs to be considered. If you're going to blame Kurtzman, you need to be blaming CBS. They're the ones that made all the decisions. They're the ones that said where they want to go. They're the ones that hired Kurtzman. They're the ones that approved everything, right? They're steering the ship. And, I think that the thing that's blatantly obvious is that there's a lot of people at CBS who are not making the best business decisions, starting with suing Axanar, right? Just, you have a track record of making bad decisions when it comes to Star Trek and protecting your IP.
The good thing about being a fan of this particular ecosystem writ large is that regardless of what happens with any of the shows that are currently on the air, I've got 750 episodes of the previous Star Trek series. If you include the animated series, I think it works out to like 747 or 750 or something like that. So if I were to rewatch one of those a day, it's a good solid 2 years and that's not including books and fan produced material and all the stuff on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So when push comes to shove, I can get my Star Trek fix. I don't need Alex Kurtzman to get my Star Trek fix. If he can give me a fix, then that's great too, right? But I sort of look at it as there's plenty of stuff out there that I can use to entertain myself. And I'm planning on going back, and I want to get to the point where I'm like watching one episode of something Star Trek a day. I want to just start. I think I'm going to do them in order that they were produced. So I'll do Enterprise last. But I think I'm just going to start with the original series and work my way through one a day. Because there's I've had people tell me it's like, there's a few things that they've said, yeah, there's more exceptions to that than you think there are, Chris. And it's like, okay, fair enough. It's been a long time since I've seen some of this stuff. It's time to go back and rewatch all that stuff.
Yeah. We're all Star Trek fans here, and we don't have to like each other's Star Trek.
Yeah.
There are people that grew up on Next Generation that thinks it's the cat's meow. It's not there's so much I don't like about the Star Trek The Next Generation, despite loving some of Next Generation.
Yeah, and I need to go back and rewatch it because I've always thought the Next Gen was my preferred. I might have to change that to Deep Space Nine. I still think, though, from what I've seen, that the single best piece that came out of the entire franchise is an episode of Next Generation.
Say that again? I'm sorry?
I think the single best thing that the franchise ever produced is one particular episode of Next Generation.
Which is?
Yesterday's Enterprise.
Yeah, Yesterday's Enterprise is my favorite episode of Next Generation. And if it wasn't for the bad reuse of the Monster Maroons, it'd be a perfect Star Trek episode.
Yeah, and I've seen what the original script looked like, and it was good that they did. The changes they made were good changes, right? People always talk about, I want to see the director's cut. I've seen the director's cut of Aliens where they added everything. The changes they made were good. It was a better product as a result of doing that. But I mean, that in particular, that scene where Tasha Yar goes to request a transfer.
Yeah.
That's great. That and the scene before it, the one where she's talking with Guinan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff is great. And I was just listening to Ben Davidson of Eagle Moss talking about, I guess he was part of the writing team back then. And, and he said that writing that episode was total chaos and everyone thought it was going to be a total flop. And they were all shocked at how well it turned out.
Yeah, well, it started off with so there's actually a book about that episode because that was based upon what one of the writers had done. As I understand it, they got 2 script treatments that were kind of the same. And they said, they sort of did that Reese's Peanut Butter Cup thing and said, why don't we just mix them together? And it worked in the end. But one of those authors wrote a book about it. It's not very long, but he wrote a book called The Making of Yesterday's Enterprise.
Yeah.
And he talked about all the stuff that got left on the cutting room floor. Now, I think it was Berman that said that if he had known that they were going to end up making next gen movies, they never would have made that script into an episode. They would have kept it in their pocket, and it would have been one of the movies.
Well, that makes total sense.
And I'm glad they didn't do that because one of the things that I've really come away with is I believe that Star Trek is at its best when it's on the small screen. There's none of the movies have captured me. I can point to a bunch of episodes that I think are better than the movies. In fact, my standard on watching one of the movies when it comes on is I ask myself, would I rather watch right now, would I rather watch this movie, or would I rather watch yesterday's Enterprise twice? And if I conclude I'd rather turn the movie off and watch yesterday's Enterprise twice, I will not watch the movie.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard that, part of the challenge with the Star Trek movies is making it about fighting an enemy, because that's never what a Star Trek episode is about, right? It's always about solving a problem. So that's why something like Star Trek 4 is so good, because there's no enemy. You're solving a problem, right? Arguably, so.
And that's my favorite. Well, that's my second favorite Star Trek movie. My favorite Star Trek movie is Galaxy Quest.
I gotcha.
Just like I think the best Star Trek show on TV right now is the Orville.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. All right, well, listen, we're at 11, an hour and a half, and I have got to take care of the dogs here. So I think we've basically come to the conclusion that the Titan in Picard season 3 is not a refit.
Yeah.
That is basically, great, same computer core. That doesn't make it a refit. It's an entirely new ship. And Riker misspoke. And, for things like this, there's an exercise that I think David Gerald had in his Star Trek book way back in the day, where it's like, if you can fix it by just crossing out a word or something like that, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it, right? And so there's a lot of these things that I sort of like, I fix it in headcanon, right? So there's nothing wrong with that ship that can't be fixed by just going like, yeah, that the part where they talked about it being a refit, that never happened. Yeah.
It's never happened.
I'm with you.
You can cross off like one line and fix the problem, or a couple, right? You have to cross off the line about deleting all of Riker's stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you. Well, listen, they could bring the computer core. It might be the same computer core. Maybe they salvage a computer core. I don't know. But, well, thank you for having me on. As always welcome. Always happy to be here. We always and thanks to the audience, which as always is, you guys are really good tonight. A lot of good discussion, a lot of good questions, a lot of good comments. You guys were great tonight. I do want to, before we go, just a couple things. One, sure. Please make sure you sign up for the Axanar newsletter down there, axanar.com.
Yep.
You'll see the link up top. Sign up for the newsletter so you get all the news. And please go to our Patreon and join up and support Aries Studios. We only get to keep making what we're making because of you guys. So and support the studio, support that wonderful set. There's a new video up all about it's a tour of the studio since it's been. I mean, we really did an amazing job getting it ready for the shoot. So check it out there too. So there you go, guys.
All right, sounds good.
Well, thanks so much, everyone.
So, Alec, if you could, do you want to take us out or shall I?
You go. I'll. What you do the honors.
All right. Good night, everybody. Live long and prosper.
Take care.